Good morning, everyone. It's my great pleasure and honor to welcome you to the final morning plenary session of what has been a fantastic conference. Our first speaker this morning is Dr. Robin Chazdon. She's going to be presenting her talk, Restoring Forest Biomes, Advances and Challenges. It's fantastic to have Robin on our program this morning. She's a professor emerita in the Ecology and Evolutionary Biology Department at the University of Connecticut in the eastern United States. Robin, as many of you know, has had a truly remarkable career in the ecology and restoration of tropical forest ecosystems, with important contributions to understanding of forest dynamics, drivers of land use change, and functional ecology of tropical trees. She has co-authored over 140 publications. She's co-edited two books on tropical forests. And importantly, in 2014, she published her sole authored book, Second Growth, The Promise of Tropical Forest Regeneration in an Age of Deforestation. For these contributions, she's been cited over 18,000 times. But not only has Robin made huge contributions through her scientific publications, she has also played a leadership role in the field through her service activities, which are numerous. She has served as editor-in-chief of the journal Biotropica, president of the Association for Tropical Biology and Conservation. She's been a member at large on the governing board of the Ecological Society of America, and she's been a member of the board of directors of Ecologic Development Fund. Currently, she's serving as the executive director of the Association for Tropical Biology and Conservation, and also as the director of the NSF-funded research coordination network called Partners, People and Reforestation in the Tropics, which is focused on understanding the social and ecological drivers of reforestation. Robin worked for 28 years as a university professor, but now she's shifted her focus into the science policy arena. She's recently become a senior fellow with the World Resources Institute Global Restoration Initiative. And she is also currently working as a research professor with the Tropical Forests and People Center at the University of Sunshine Coast, and as a senior research associate with the International Institute of Sustainability in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. So I want to welcome to the stage Dr. Robin Chazdon. We're so pleased to have you this morning. And you can use this microphone or this. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and I want to thank all of you for getting up this morning and coming to the session. And it's really an honor to be among the stellar plenary speakers at this conference, which has really been awesome, very enlightening to me, and much exceeding any expectations that I had. So now I would like to jolt you out of your sleepy condition and ask you to put on your seatbelts, because we're going to go on an airplane. We start out our airplane in Belo Horizonte in the state of Minas Gerais, and as soon as we lift off, we look down and we see a lot of what has made Minas Gerais famous, mines. And here's one example. I'm not sure what they're mining here, but you see them one after another after the plane takes off. And then you also see many of these kinds of landscapes. Oh, I should say also we have a window seat, and there's no clouds. And you have a little iPhone camera with you. So we pass over landscapes, which I would call a tropical mosaic landscape, where you have a mixture of remnant forests, usually in the slopes, and the hillsides, pastures, cultivated crops, and villages, just a huge mixture of all kinds of different land uses. And you see this kind of landscape for many, many, many kilometers. And it's very typical of much of southern Brazil. And then after a couple of hours, you wake up from a little nap and you look out the window, and it's unbroken forest as far as you can see. The only discontinuity is from a river. And I don't know how many of you had the opportunity. I've flown over the Amazon many, many times, but it's either been the middle of the night or it's been cloudy. And I had never seen this before. And I felt like I was living a dream, to look out and see as far as I could see, unbroken tropical forest. And then also to see what the rivers do to the landscape and how they paint the forest in different shades of green and blue and brown. And then after a little while, you see again the human-modified landscape. In this case, I'm not sure where we were, but it's a very hilly landscape with lots of deforestation and erosion on the hills. And it was almost as if waking up from the dream, and you see what is really out there in most of the world. So today I wanted to sort of look from above what is going on with forest restoration. I'm not only going to refer to tropics in this talk, and I want to do this by looking at three different sides of the whole process. One of those is theory. So by this I mean conceptual frameworks, I mean research. It's about the way we think. Okay. The second part of this is practice. So this is about what we do and how we do it. And it involves the entire process from planning to implementation to monitoring and how we do all of these things. And the third corner is policy. This is about the governance piece. It's also about the finance piece. Now, some people would put finance in the practice corner, and again, I'll get to that in a little while. It's kind of in between. But it also includes incentives for restoration and targets and the factors that motivate policymakers to do what they do. So I'm going to go through each of these three aspects and talk about what advances I see that we've made with regard to forest restoration and some of the challenges. So first, I'm going to go through the theory part. And one of the big advances I've seen is that we're starting to develop an understanding of how degradation is linked to recovery of forests. And this graph illustrates some of that concept, that the degradation on the y-axis, the extent of degradation, and on the x-axis is the time for recovery. This could be any ecosystem, but here I'm thinking about forest recovery, which takes a very long time, and it takes much longer when the level of degradation, the extent of degradation is greater. And it can even reach a point here where the extent of degradation is beyond the ability of the system to recover, and a different type of system would take place. And I have had the privilege of experiencing, and this is one of the only advantages of getting on in life to an advanced age, and that is that you can actually see an entire forest growing up in your own lifetime. This is an area in Costa Rica at the edge of, it was at the edge of La Selva Biological Station, and I visited this area when it was a farm. It was a completely clean pasture. And when it became 12 years old, I was able to start establishing some long-term research, and we've been following this forest for 20 years, every year. So we know the trees personally. And this is now 32 years old. And many people would look at this and walk in this forest and not realize that it really isn't a mature forest. So when the level of degradation is relatively low, the soil was intact, it hadn't been farmed for very many years, it was a pasture with very few cows. The recovery can be fantastic. And there was not a single tree planted in this forest. This is all completely natural regeneration. So this can happen, and I've seen this happen, and it has motivated me tremendously. Another big advance is in the conceptual area is the shift towards systems thinking. And I'll explain what I mean here. That is, if you look at the objectives or the ambition that we have for forest restoration, so the lowest level is really just to build or create a forest that has some similar structure to a reference forest, not caring very much about the component species or their functions, just put something in there that looks like a forest. But we have elevated these ambitions, and another level is to care about what species you have in that forest and what habitats you're providing. Yet another higher level is to create a forest that actually has the right dynamics to sustain populations for a long time. And an even higher level is to restore a lot of the important ecological processes that we want, and even the disturbance regimes that will maintain that forest. And then I think the highest level we can shoot for is really to build forests that are resilient to climate shocks and other kinds of shocks that we know happen. So we've seen this evolution, and I think in many cases projects are really shooting for that highest level now, which even 10 years ago was barely even discussed. And the third advance in this realm is understanding the variability and the drivers of variability of the mechanisms of forest recovery and forest restoration, and looking at the trajectories and how variable they are, and appreciating that and using that to our advantage. And here is just one example from some of my work with the Costa Rica plots, which is understanding the dynamics of biomass accumulation as an outcome of the demography of species, early successional specialists, generalists, and late successional specialists that are coming into the forest system. So now I'm going to move to the practice side and talk about some of those advances. And a huge advance, and I've seen this in many parts of the world that I've visited, is the so many improvements in the supply chains and in the nursery practices that are the basis for planting and active restoration. And just here's one example in the Philippines where they have developed excellent nursery practices involving the local community with native tree species. They also have very good provisions for growing wildings and avoiding mortality of wildings. And these practices are starting to spread now throughout the Philippines. And of course, in Brazil, they have probably the most sophisticated supply chain development. So this is a huge advance. And also, in terms of planning the restoration practices, we now have seen many advances in multi-criteria prioritization methods that allow very careful planning of restoration areas that maximize and optimize different qualities. And here's just one example from central Chile, where the potential for forest restoration was examined in two ways. In the red, these are areas for forest planting or restoration, and in the green, they're areas for natural regeneration. I'm sorry, the black, I can't see from the slide. Natural regeneration, and the green are areas of existing forest. So we can do the best job possible in planning and allocation of limited funds and planning to maximize specific goals for restoration. And third, we really, beginning, as we can see in the days of this conference, a lot of discussion about how do we link small-scale plantings with large-scale forest restoration goals. And here's one example that I learned about, which is in Ashland, Oregon. And it's a project where the community is very heavily involved in trying to restore the large forest areas surrounding this, in the mountains surrounding this area that have had fire suppression and where there's a huge vulnerability to catastrophic fire that would spread into the city for sure. And together with many agencies, they've been implementing a very large-scale project.
Forests provide the clean air, water, and wildlife we love. Science shows our forest needs periodic mild fire to reduce the risk of severe wildfire. We work to protect our forests and water and keep our community safe by bringing back mild fire applied by professional teams. Safely controlled burns during cool seasons and mild weather also minimize smoke. So if you smell or see smoke this time of year, just know we're carrying the torch for healthier forests and community together.
So as you can see here, the U.S. Forest Service is working together with this local forest resiliency group, with the Nature Conservancy, a restoration organization, to carry out this 10-year project. And they also have an extensive monitoring program, which is multi-sectorial, and different groups carry out monitoring of birds and trees and lakes, and it's a really integrated landscape project. And finally, for advances in practice, we've seen a tendency, which is very promising, to integrate more the local community and with active stakeholder engagement. And also, this project is an example. They have a very detailed engagement plan. Okay. I'd also like to highlight another really big advance, which is this program that is being organized through the UN CBD called the Forest Restoration Ecosystem Restoration Initiative, which has now 12 projects in the portfolio, and it's going to be adding more every year, financed through the Korean Forest Service. And these projects are also very heavily integrating stakeholder engagement. So now I'm going to turn to some of the challenges and big hurdles that we face. And on the theory side, one of these is a huge issue, which is how do we actually define and conceptualize forest degradation and identify these areas. And that means identifying what are going to be our prime targets for restoration. Are they going to be the most degraded areas, or are they going to be the areas where we can actually do it easier? And sometimes we're fortunate because there are big billboards that actually point this out to us. In Portuguese, this says available for restoration. And you see these signs a lot on the road between Piracicaba and Campinas. So there's lots of abandoned or degraded pastures that are available. That's a pretty easy one. But there are many other contexts where it's not so easy. And somebody might look and say, oh, that's really degraded. We've got to restore that. But other people say, whoa, that's my main source of food. And we also have degradation at all different hierarchical levels. So you can have a habitat that's degraded, but inside a relatively intact landscape. And you can have a very degraded landscape where you actually have land that's not degraded. So it's very important to target what level we're talking about in terms of degradation. And also understanding the trade-offs, particularly in space, between different kinds of restoration objectives is a really huge challenge, because we often have a situation where sites that maximize, for example, carbon storage, this is Uganda, are not the same areas where restoration can improve water quality. And these are not the same areas where we're going to have the best benefits for biodiversity, or we'll be able to have lower opportunity costs. So we have conflicts across these, and a huge challenge in how to manage those. And another challenge that's come up every single day at this conference is this challenge of linking the small scale with the large scale. And just the definitions and concepts of restoration are really all over the place. So here's the SER definition. Here's the bond challenge definition. And for example, here's the U.S. Forest Service's definition of what restoration is all about. And they're not all talking about the same thing. So in practice, there are also big challenges. One is, where do we spend our money, and where do we determine where we need to have active restoration approaches versus where can natural regeneration take care of this at a much lower cost? And we're seeing some approaches here with looking at the potential, mapping the potential for natural regeneration, and where there's low potential, that signals areas where we should do our active restoration. But we're far from doing this globally. Many forest restoration projects start out fine and then they fail, and they don't carry out the long-term objectives. This is actually much more common than we realize, and this is also true of natural regeneration. That most areas, and this is in Pucallpa, Peru, very high rate of clearance of young second-growth forests that never get a chance to grow up. And a small study of restoration projects in Costa Rica has shown also that the cases where they're Costa Rican owned had a very high mortality rate of forest restoration projects. So what's going on with this? How can we help to make these more long-term as they were intended to be? I don't have examples for these, but another huge challenge in practice is making restoration more cost-effective. And also the whole looming challenge of how this is all going to work out with climate change. Now in policy, there are many challenges. I'm just going to highlight a few. One is that there are many cases where the agencies in the government simply fail to recognize where degradation is happening and just look away. So here's some examples in Canada and Russia in the boreal forest, where there's been a very high rate of loss of intact forest landscapes. So this is, by definition, forest degradation at the fringes of, or inside these interior landscapes. And these countries are not really recognizing that as degradation. They're not doing anything about it. I won't belabor this one about land use rights and land tenure, but this is a huge challenge and obstacle to restoration. And we still have a situation in the majority of forest lands in the world that are government lands. So it's not just a question of what individual landowners want to do. Okay, thanks. Finally, forestry and forest restoration is usually planned and thought of by people who are thinking about forests. This makes sense, right? But it really doesn't make sense. We have to really think way beyond the forest here, and we have to integrate this with agriculture and conservation, or else, and at all levels, local levels, regional levels as well. It's essential if we're going to have this longevity of forest restoration. And here is just one statement from that was made at the World Forestry Congress recently, that it's time for a change in consciousness. And it is a fact. Agriculture and forestry can no longer be treated in isolation. Linking these two is imperative for socioeconomic development in the 21st century, but it's also imperative for forest restoration. And FAO has recognized this, and they actually have a really useful document that shows how to link and the importance of linking forestry and agriculture sectors. I think we need much more of this, and also linking forestry and conservation sectors, linking all three. And also the leakage, so many countries or regions that are boasting increases in forest cover due to restoration or reforestation, often this is associated with deforestation in some other area of the country or some other part of the world that's compensating for the wood supply that's needed. And this needs to be investigated much further. So for the rest of this talk, though, I want to really look at all three of these things and look at the intersections among them, because that is really what's important. And in terms of the linkage between theory and practice, these are double-ended arrows. They go both ways. So this is about applying theory to practice, but it's also learning from practice and applying that back to our concepts and theory. And also requesting more research so that better practices can be developed. And there's a huge gap here. It's often called the research practice gap or the knowing-doing gap, and this needs to be discussed a lot more. We see many cases where local knowledge has definitely powered practice in restoration, but that uptake of knowledge is not happening so much from scientists. And how can we ease that transfer of knowledge? How can we make that happen? And it's a problem on both sides. Scientists really do a bad job of communicating their results in ways that are appealing or can be taken up by practitioners. And practitioners also distrust or don't want to listen to what scientists have to say. So this is often due to the fact that scientists and practitioners are not working together on the same projects. They each have their own areas where they're working. And there are very few examples where the practitioners are really working in close association or actually are scientists themselves. And then you can see this transfer happening. Another is way to improve this transfer is through participatory research. And that's very different from the traditional mode of research that's top-down. Okay, I'm finished, here's my results, voila, see how great they are. But really, if you involve stakeholders in the design and collection of data and then in discussing the results, they're invested in this work. They see how relevant it is to what they want to do. The link between theory and policy, many, many gaps here, science policy gaps, but also it goes both ways. So it's not just a matter of the policymakers not taking up the science, but the scientists need to listen to the policymakers and apply and do the kind of science that is needed for policy-relevant research. And this is difficult because of huge gaps in language, in precision, and in the way scientists think about what they do and the way policymakers think about what they do. And the words. How many re-words do you know? And you've seen these bantered around, and there's really very little definition of what these are, and it's actually getting to be ridiculous. So these science policy gaps, as I said, scientists really need to listen and have an opportunity. And this is a problem. There's been little space for this interaction to take place. And we really need to create more opportunities for scientists and policymakers to have discussions, to talk to each other about what kinds of knowledge gaps there are. And in this paper, we discuss how broad policy goals can be used to motivate research on all sorts of different questions, all the way from questions that are important to local communities, to corporate landowners, to forestry and agriculture specialists. And all of these different stakeholders have a role to play in the big global policy or the big national policy goals. And scientists can help to understand how to make effective restoration work. So more dialogue, more partnerships. So the last one here is the link between practice and policy. And in here, we're talking about using policy incentives to promote best practices, but we're also looking at how practices can be aligned to conform and to support broader policy goals. And here, there's also a big gap. And especially when there's top-down forest policy that is really insensitive to the realities on the ground and is just spinning wheels. Incentives that the policymakers make that end up being perverse or being ignored or being used to make offsets that are not effectively doing forest restoration. So we need to have a better understanding of when top-down policies can be effective and when we need more locally driven programs. And there's a huge need, as many in the room recognize, for developing best practices, but these really have to be very finely attuned to the local, regional, and national context. So, in my view, where we need to go with restoring forests, and this is really more on the global scale, is to integrate all three of these components and to not just focus on the science, or not just focus on the practice, and not just focus on the policy, but to really look at this holistically in the future. So this is the time to do it. And I think this is our mission, those of us who do forest restoration, and I think we really need to do it together. So, thank you.
We have some time for questions, and we have assistants with microphones who will be passing through the audience, so take a minute. It always takes people a minute to get going here. Is this group at the time? They brought out the 10-minute timer, and I had to go tell them. I freaked out, but I'm really sorry. I practiced it so Yes, people are waking up from last night's activities. Yeah. Okay. Oh, they're popping up now in various sectors. We have one here and one towards the back.
That was very interesting, Robin. This is Annabelle Ford, and I was wondering how you look at this participatory research. What would be give an example of a bottom-up, on-the-ground participatory research idea you're thinking of?
Well, in terms of some of the restoration methodologies, I think consulting with local landowners first before you begin experimenting is really useful because they have experience already. So they can tell you, oh, you shouldn't plant that tree, or you should consider planting trees in islands instead of in big plantations. Or, the birds will come to these trees, but they don't come to these other trees or this time of year. So they can provide a lot of guidance in terms of developing the focus of your work so that it's relevant to the local context.
Hi, thank you very much for pulling all that together. And I was just wondering if you could provide an example or two where you've seen top-down approaches work well.
Not really. Well, no, I mean, China is sort of the epitome of the top-down approach, and in fact, despite the bad press and the reality that there's been a huge amount of not very ecologically relevant reforestation there have been some very good successes with farmers with that program involving natural regeneration, involving fruit trees, and eventually devolving some of the decisions locally. So there can be a top-down approach that allows some flexibility at the local level, which can be very successful. Good, thank you.
Robin, thank you so much for the excellent tour of forest restoration, and also for your particular focus on integration among science, management, and policy. And we have a token of appreciation for you, and we just really want to thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you.
And there's a certificate of attendance as well. We're going to shift focus now to grassland ecosystems. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Elise Buisson, who is an associate professor at the University of Avignon in France, in the Mediterranean Institute of Biodiversity and Ecology. Elise has authored nearly 100 articles on plant community ecology, conservation, and restoration. And of course, she has a particular focus on grassland ecosystems. Her work has advanced ideas related to how ecological communities assemble and the mechanisms by which species coexist. And in particular, she's worked to infuse these ideas into ecosystem management activities. Elise has played a very important role to the Society for Ecological Restoration. She has been involved in our conferences for the last 20 years, and she's also been a very active board member of SER Europe since 2010. Many of you may remember her, though, for her leadership role in planning the excellent SER Europe conference in Avignon. There we go. Elise is also well known for her tremendous leadership in federating the French-speaking community of scientists and practitioners in ecological restoration, bringing these groups together and creating Revere. Elise has a global perspective on grassland ecosystem restoration through her work not only in Europe, but also in the US and in Brazil, where she is now mentoring 2 PhD students. So I want to welcome Elise to the stage for her talk, What Do We Know About Tropical Grassland Resilience and Their Restoration? You have the monitor there where you can see. If you prefer a microphone, there's one here. Do you want the mic? You're here. Okay.
Thank you, Kara, for the introduction. And I would like to thank the organizing committee and the scientific committee for giving me the opportunity to give this talk this morning. And I would also like to thank all my co-authors who helped me to put this paper together, and without whom I wouldn't be able to present this work to you today. So I'm going to be talking first about tropical old-growth grasslands, and then about what we know of their resilience and restoration. And I want to start with a little definition. Both grasslands and savannas are lands with continuous herbaceous cover. The difference is that the grasslands have less than 10% of tree cover. These grassy ecosystems cover about 40% of the land surface on Earth. And if we talk just about tropical grasslands and savannas, they cover 20% of land on Earth, which makes them, just by the amount that we have, an interesting ecosystem to study, important ecosystem to study. When I talk about tropical grasslands and savanna, what people usually think about first are the savannas of the Serengeti with like the tall, flat trees and impalas and giraffes and lions and elephants. You do have a lot of these savannas out there in Tanzania, Zimbabwe, and South Africa. But you do also have grasslands, such as the grasslands of the Katanga Copper Belt in Congo, or the highland rocky grasslands of Madagascar, in a mosaic with tapia savannas. You, of course, have savannas in Southern America, such as the one in Bolivia or French Guiana. And you, of course, all know the savannas of Brazil, called the Cerrado, and some grasslands also located in the Cerrado biome, for example, the rocky grasslands that you find in the mountains. Moving towards Asia, of course, you have also savannas and grasslands there, such as the Shola grasslands in the Western Ghats of India. A bit further north, you have native grasslands supporting native antelopes and birds. And you have many more savannas in Asia. I'm not going to detail. There's a really good recent paper by Ratnam that talks about all these different kinds of savannas you have there. You also have a wide range of grasslands and savannas in Australia. All of these grasslands and savannas have common characteristics, and I'm going to talk about that a little later. But these characteristics can also be found in some of the grasslands and savannas of the subtropics, such as the longleaf pine savannas in the southern US, coastal and highland grasslands in South Africa, and the southern grasslands of Brazil and the Pampa. So I hope now I've convinced you that you probably work pretty close to one of these really nice and native grasslands, and that you should be aware of them. The thing is that in the tropics, you also have a lot of secondary grasslands or anthropogenic grasslands. On this particular picture, it's really easy to see that it's a secondary one because it looks like a planted pastures with one species of grass and cows in the middle. So, it's really easy to see that it's anthropogenic. But it's not always that easy. And here I've put for you a picture of an anthropogenic savanna and one of a native savanna. One is a bit pixelized, but I want you to try to think which one's which before I tell you a little more. They're not so easy to distinguish, and you would probably have to go in the grassland, in a grass layer, looking at the herbaceous plant to figure which one's the native and which one's the secondary one. If you put them into their landscape, it's a bit easier to see that the one on the left is the anthropogenic one, and the one on the right is the native one. But when you're not used to it, or when you don't know the species, it's not so easy to see the difference. And that's been really detrimental to the conservation of native savannas, because they've been long misinterpreted as the result of deforestation. That's why, with a bunch of colleagues, we came up with the old-growth concept. You all know about old-growth forests and the fact that they are mature forests with a high diversity and dead wood and valuable ecosystem services. Well, old-growth grasslands are just the same, and they are ancient ecosystems that are characterized by their particular species composition, a high herbaceous species richness, and high endemism. When they're healthy, these ecosystems are also characterized by intact disturbance regime, such as fire and sometimes grazing. They also have a lot of species with underground storage organ, and so they have high below-ground carbon storage. And they have also fire adaptation, such as the underground storage organ and the bud bank from which there is sprout after fire. They have fire-insulated bark and fire sometimes stimulated flowering or germination. Let's move on to the ecosystem services of these savannas and grasslands. It turns out that if you compare the groundwater recharge of a forest and a savanna with the same amount of water, rainfall falling on them, the forest has more evapotranspiration and more transpiration, and so less groundwater recharge. And for example, the Cerrado is the headwaters of 3 major rivers in Brazil. And if you end up planting trees on the Cerrado, you will end up with less water in the rivers. Carbon storage in forests is mostly above ground. I'm not saying here there's no roots. I'm just saying that, the majority of the carbon storage is above ground, while in the savannas and grasslands, it's below ground in the roots and storage organs that they have, which actually makes it protected from fire because, of course, the fire is not going to impact whatever is below ground. And it's very important for fire-prone ecosystems. If you plant eucalyptus on nice Cerrado grassland and it burns, then you've lost the below ground because you planted the eucalyptus and destroyed the savanna, but you're going to lose your above ground carbon storage as well. There's a lot of other ecosystem services. I'm not going to go into detail, but you have also social diversity supported by these grasslands and savannas and ecotourism, for example. Altogether, tropical grasslands and savannas are increasing in the world due to forest clearing and planted pasture for raising cattle. But the ones that are increasing in surface are the secondary or anthropogenic grasslands and savannas, which are poor in species. Just like old-growth forests, old-growth native grasslands and savannas are decreasing in the world due to afforestation, agriculture, but also they are being degraded by changes in fire regimes or invasive species introduction. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about afforestation and agriculture. On this map, you can see the past agricultural conversion in the world. In orange, you have the pastures, and in green, you have the cropland. And funnily enough, you can see that this map corresponds kind of to the map of the grassland I've shown you before. That's because, well, if you have the choice, it's so much easier to put a crop or a pasture on the land that's already open. Of course, in forested landscape, people have been deforesting to put their crops and pastures, but in a landscape that has a mosaic or that's open, it's just going to be easier to do so. That's why grasslands have been targeted for agricultural conversion in the past. It's still going on. Here you have a map of the Cerrado between 1994 and 2010. All the red and the brown are the pastures and the crops, and you can see it increases quite a bit in these just 15 years. And 50% of the Cerrado has been lost to agricultural, has been lost, period, and 30% of it to pastures. And this is not over because grasslands and savannas are still being targeted for agricultural development, like the one in Guinea on this report. And I'm not saying that there shouldn't be any agriculture anywhere. Of course, we need to provide food. But if agriculture has to be settled in savanna, it has to be on secondary or anthropogenic savannas and not on the old-growth ones. Now I'm going to talk about afforestation, and first I want to give you definitions of these two terms, and I took the definitions from IPCC. So reforestation is the establishment of trees or forest where there was recent tree cover. And this is, on this picture, this is us, people from the conference last Sunday, planting trees on an area that used to be forest, then was converted for agriculture and is now being restored to a riparian forest. Afforestation refers to the planting of trees on areas that didn't have trees for much longer. And it can be, afforestation can be plantings, just like on the picture, but it can also be more diverse. It's still very different. It's still an action that's very different from reforestation because basically in reforestation, you're planting trees where they belong, while with afforestation, you're planting trees where they don't belong. And on top of it being a bit scary to start with, IPCC writes a bit further down on their website that they don't make the difference between the two actions in the accounting for the implementation of the Kyoto Protocol, which is even scarier for the non-forest ecosystems because they can be easily targeted for mitigation of greenhouse gas emission. And this is happening. I took the example from India, where the government has been considering a lot of the grasslands, whether they're native or secondary, as wastelands, and they target it for agriculture, industry, development, and also for afforestation, like on these pictures of the Shola grassland being planted with wattle. I've also seen some weird stuff here at the conference, especially in the poster session, like this poster where people have been planting trees to restore a pasture, an abandoned pastures. Then most of the trees died, and they realized that the reference ecosystem is a campo sujo, which don't have trees. That's probably why it didn't work. So at least they realized their mistake and they explain why it didn't work. But when you do restore grassland, the main part of the grassland is the actual herbaceous cover, so you don't want to be planting trees to restore them usually. I've also seen this poster where people are planting trees, I think riparian trees, in a nice grassland that looks pretty healthy to me. It's a wet grassland called vereda. And coming to this map, I've been wanting to put little stickers on this map, but I didn't because I don't work in forest, and the title of the map is put a little, put where you're working for forests. And what's interesting is that there's a lot of stickers in the Cerrado area. So I was wondering, do a lot of people think they're working in forest when they work in the Cerrado? Or maybe there's a lot of people working in the dry forest of the Cerrado, because there's also some dry forests out there, and riparian forest, of course. But it made me a little uncomfortable that there were so many stickers in the Cerrado area. But there's also some really good stuff out there. So people being aware that restoration is not just about planting tree, and that's the title of the document by IUCN. We've also written a paper showing that in some places it's bad to be planting trees for restoration, for biodiversity. And there's examples, like more precise example with the one in Kenya or in the Cerrado. And you have this really recent paper by Pedro and Robin saying that you cannot be afforesting the native grasslands and savannas when doing forest restoration, which is good to say. So now let's move on to the part about the resilience. And by resilience, I mean resistance and recovery to disturbances. And by disturbances, I'm going to be talking about endogenous and natural disturbances with which the ecosystem evolved, and the exogenous disturbances, which are usually new and result from changes in human activities. And I'm going to start with an endogenous disturbance, which is fire, and I'm going to talk first about the Cerrado, since we are here in Brazil. And there are a lot of paper, a lot of literature on the fact that the Cerrado is adapted to fire. And I've just selected a few that are really recent. Like this one by Julie Pausas as an homage to Professor Coutinho, saying that the natural fire regime selected for adapted plant. And particularly, he was talking about flowering, which is influenced by fire, and drives the quantity and quality of flowers in the system. This other paper saying that the fire has been an important evolutionary factor in the Cerrado, and showing different adaptations such as thick bark or underground storage organs with buds from which they sprout after fire. And this one paper on grasslands showing that whether the fire was 25 years ago or whether the fire burned the grassland 1 year ago, it doesn't change the species richness, and it actually doesn't change the composition either, which means that the fire don't kill anything. Everything just resprouts really fast. And all tropical grasslands and savanna are pretty much adapted to fire. They have thick, corky, spongy barks. They have underground storage organs with bud from which they resprout. These buds can also be useful to resprout after being grazed on. But grazing is a bit more complicated, because for some grasslands and savannas, grazing is endogenous disturbance, such as in Africa or in Australia with kangaroos. As you can see on this graph, the spiny trees evolved at the same time as the bovids in Africa. But there's also some places where it can be considered as an exogenous disturbance, such as, for example, in the Campo Rupestre, this grassland in the highlands of central Brazil, where if you put cattle, because the soils are so shallow, the cattle is just going to trample and destroy the vegetation and the soil. So there's also this paper showing that in Africa the trees are higher to escape grazing, while in neotropical savannas the trees have thicker bark to resist fire. So anyways, it's not so easy to know if grazing is good or not for your area. You really have to be doing regional studies to find out. It really depends anywhere anyway, it depends where, when, and how grazing is applied. Where in the world and in the region, when, because the season can also have different effects on grazing, and how the stocking rates, of course, but also whether you have both the native and the cattle, the native mammals grazing and the cattle or not. So all of these factors have to be taken into account to find out if you can use grazing as a management tool or not. In southern Brazil, for example, where fire management is restricted, low-intensity grazing has been used to keep the grasslands open and to avoid trees and shrubs to encroach on these grasslands. Then let's talk about exogenous disturbances, such as drastic changes in the natural disturbances of the system, afforestation and tree invasion, exotic species invasion. To all of these exogenous disturbances, resilience depends on the intensity and the duration of the disturbance, because that's what's going to influence the quality and the quantity of the internal species pool from which the system is going to recover. This is study showing the effect of afforestation 4 to 17 years after the trees were taken down. You can see that there's still a big difference in species richness of forbs, even 17 years after the trees were taken down. The system is not resilient. After agriculture and mining, the resilience is really low, because usually when you cultivate or when you do mining, you're going to be turning the soil around or plowing, and so you destroy the underground storage organs and the bud bank. Here you can see a picture of a nice grassland on the top in South Africa and a secondary grassland in the same area that was cultivated. And here you have a campo rupestre in central Brazil, and at the bottom you have a quarry in the same area 8 years after degradation. And you can see that there's very little vegetation on the ground, and the plants that are growing there are not the one from the old-growth grassland. Now let's move on to what we know about restoration. We did a little search in restoration ecology to find out how many papers there were on tropical forest restoration, and that's not even taking into account the cloud forest or the rainforest, just plain tropical forest. And we ended up with about 100 articles. We did the same search for tropical grasslands and tropical, subtropical grasslands and savannas, and we ended up with 8 relevant articles. So you can see there's a big gap in the research between what we know about restoration for forests and what we know about restoration for grasslands and savannas. If you look at the talks and poster for this conference, it turns out that 50% of them are about tropical forest and subtropical forest, while only 13% of the talks are about savannas and grassland, and that includes tropical and temperate. So because there's a big knowledge gap here, I won't be able to show you too many studies talking about grassland, tropical grassland and savanna restoration. What I'm going to do is show you a few studies and also compare it to what we know about temperate grassland restoration, because this is very well known. So what we usually do when we do temperate grassland restoration is that we prepare the site. There's often some plowing, harrowing, or soil inversion. This is particularly if you want to get rid of the seed bank of weeds or invasive species, you're going to do this. In tropical grassland, of course, you don't want to be doing this, because if you do plow, you're going to kill the bud bank and the underground storage organs that might still be there. The one time that you can, the cases where you could be doing this is when the site is already so degraded or has been degraded by agriculture that your bud bank is already gone anyways, and you have a lot of exotic species, then you can be plowing in order to get rid of some of the weeds before doing the restoration. Then in temperate grasslands, sometimes what we do is soil transfer. We take the soil on an area that's nice and going to be destroyed, and we bring it over to a site to be restored. That allows to bring the seed bank and good soil. We tried this in wet grasslands of the Cerrado, and it turns out that it worked a little bit. We managed to transfer nicely about 5 species, but compared to the amount of species that's in the native grassland, it's very little. Then it's been done also in Congo at larger scales, and the results are a bit different depending on the type of grassland, but altogether you lose the structure of the vegetation of the community, of the plant community anyway. It works a little bit better on the grasslands that have high copper concentration, where you will end up with some target species, while on the grasslands that have lower copper concentration, you lose most of the target species and you end up with a weed cover. Then what we do with temperate grassland restoration is that we introduce plant species, usually by sowing seeds or transferring hay. The problem with the studies that I've seen in restoring tropical grasslands and savannas is that sometimes the quantity and the quality of the seeds are low. As you can see in this experiment where hay has been transferred from old growth grassland to a degraded area, you have very low cover of vegetation in the degraded area after the hay transfer, and whatever is there anyways is not native. So nothing germinated out of the hay, and we just have a few weeds growing out there. It turns out that for this particular ecosystem, a lot of the species have seeds that are either embryoless or non-viable or dormant, which makes it really complicated to use for restoration, of course. In another case where we did hay transfer in a wet grassland of the Cerrado, we ended up with just one species, but this one species also grew in the control where we didn't do anything, so that's the one species that actually came by itself. And the hay transfer didn't manage to bring any native species to the degraded area. These experiments with direct seeding in the Cerrado are a bit more successful. You have some native species growing out there. And so this particular experiment shows that they go from 100% of exotic species cover to about 20% of exotic species cover and 40% of native. In the talks I've heard here, it seems like the exotic species after a few years are increasing. So we would need to find the right management to keep them down after introducing the native species. Also, in this particular experiment here, 25 woody species were planted and only 7 herbaceous species. When you know the species richness of the herbaceous cover of the Cerrado, 7 species is really low. And I don't want to depreciate this work. I mean, it's great people are trying to do things, but what I'm saying is that we need way more studies to try to reintroduce way more species in the herbaceous cover. And there's books with more information on the woody plants. Again, on their herbaceous species, it's not so much. I've seen this poster proposing a list of species that could be potentially used for restoration. There's quite a few poaceae, at least, in there, so herbaceous species in the list. If they were put on this list, it's probably because they can germinate, so it would be nice now to look at this list and really try to do the restoration with these species. Then the other problem that we have in tropical grasslands and savannas is that it's extremely difficult to transfer the species that have big roots and storage organs. This has been tried in Congo as well at large scale on the 2 different kinds of grasslands again. And again, it worked a little, well, again, it didn't manage to conserve the community structure. And again, it worked a little better for the grassland that has high copper concentration because they managed to conserve most of the target species, and that's because the soil is really shallow. So they managed with the bulldozer to take most of the soil and so most of the roots. While on the other grassland that has low copper concentration, the soil is much deeper. So with the bulldozer, they couldn't get deep enough to get all the roots and organs, and so most of the species that would have this kind of structure died. And so they ended up with a lot of wheat cover again. Finally, these species are extremely slow to grow. Extremely slow to grow, at least for the studies I've seen. Here we tried transfer of small turfs of grassland from a nice area to a degraded one. And we did it in kind of a nucleation pattern because we were hoping that the different little nuclei would colonize outside of their little area and join each other. And this is 4 years later. They haven't moved at all. Some individual died, but most of them are still there. Sometimes smaller, sometimes I don't think I've ever seen one bigger, but they haven't colonized outside of the little area in 4 years. So it's going to take a really long time for them to join the little nuclei that we created. So I hope I've convinced you with this talk that grasslands are beautiful, that there are lots of grasslands and savannas in the tropics that are worth conserving for their biodiversity and the ecosystem services they provide. And I hope that in the area where you work, you'll be looking for them at least, and even more that you'll start studying them. A few more pictures. Yeah. The Bone Challenge says that we have to restore 150 million hectares of land, but it doesn't say that we have to restore forests only. It says that we have to restore the deforested and degraded land. So it's not just about forests. And we need to take more care about the other ecosystems that are out there. The IUCN said it, restoration is not about just planting trees. And I guess you've all seen this little graph that Miguel showed yesterday. And I think it's kind of, we know that there are other ecosystems out there than natural forests, but maybe the general public, by seeing pictures like this, forget that there are other stuff out there. And I would really like to see a graph where there's a little more space for other kinds of ecosystems, such as the grasslands and savannas, of course, because I love them and study them, but also the wetlands and other kinds of ecosystems. Katie Sudding on Tuesday said that some ecosystems were more challenging to restore than others, but we shouldn't give up with them. And I think that if we had put as much effort in studying grassland restoration as we had for forest restoration, then we would be much further today, and we would know how to help them recover a bit faster. And these ecosystems still remain undervalued and understudied, and there's a real challenge ahead of us. And I really hope that more studies are going to come out and that I convinced you that you need to start working on the grasslands as well. Thank you very much for your attention. Muito obrigada.
Thank you so much, Elise, for introducing us to the concept of old-growth grasslands and also highlighting the importance of working across ecosystems. And we do have time for questions. I see one here.
Thank you very much. That was an absolutely fascinating presentation. I lived in the state of Iowa in the United States for many years, which is the central part and originally home of the tallgrass prairie. Almost all of that prairie has been converted to agriculture, and one result is that about half of the original topsoil in Iowa is now in the Gulf of Mexico, having eroded. One of the big things is the loss of the possibility for carbon sequestration in the soils. And I'm wondering, when you see the secondary anthropogenic savannas and grasslands, do they ever develop the deep soil horizons that then sequester carbon, or do they continue to have a very shallow horizon? And when you try to restore, particularly tropical grasslands, do you ever see again the development of the deep soil horizons that can sequester more of the carbon?
That's a really good question, and I think it still needs to be researched. I know that some research is going on right now on the roots in the Cerrado, but although I don't have any study in mind to tell you more about this, I can tell you that there's probably less carbon storage in the secondary savannas, just because in secondary savannas, most often you're gonna find trees, just like you would find trees in an old-growth savanna. So these guys are probably storing carbon as well, like kind of the same. The difference is, the main difference I think, is in the herbaceous layer, where in native savannas you would have a lot of forbs and a lot of species with the underground storage organs and the underground trees that would store a lot of carbon, while on the secondary savannas you would have maybe like way fewer species and none of the ones that have the underground storage organs. So I would think the secondary savannas would be less useful to store carbon.
Hello, here. I am Jorge Mendoza. I also want to talk about soils. And you mentioned in your trial that you move soil from one side to another. I wonder what happened to the side where you take the soil from. And also the use of caterpillars to spread the soil. We have some bad experiences in the tropics with caterpillars. They compact the soil very much. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Well, all the projects I've participated in where we take soil from somewhere to put it on the site to be restored, whether it's in the tropics or in temperate grasslands, it's always because the site where we take the soil is going to be destroyed anyways. So there's going to be development there, there's going to be construction, or something's going to happen and it's going to destroy the site. So it's just a way of salvaging the topsoil, basically. So you're still losing something good to do something not as good, but it's better than just putting the concrete on top of the nice soil. So that's that. And the second question?
Hello, yes.
Forget.
I didn't hear you mention, I was wondering, has anyone looked at the role of mycorrhizas or other soil microbiology in the relative survival of introduced or reintroduced plants?
I don't know. Probably. Sorry, I cannot tell you much about it.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Great, thank you. Fascinating presentation, and definitely nice to step outside of a lot of the forest-oriented work that we've seen over the last week. Just linking science and practice a little bit more, we've had 3 science questions, so I'm going to throw a practice one out there. You mentioned the work, lots of work on forest landscape restoration interventions that we've seen in different presentations this week. And those tend to be incremental steps towards increasing ecological productivity. I was wondering if maybe you could give some examples of how we can integrate incremental steps in human-dominated landscapes for grassland restoration?
I'm not sure I understand the question. I'm sorry.
So instead of going from a degraded ecosystem back to a ecologically restored grassland, what intermediate steps can we take in human-dominated landscapes that don't necessarily make that entire jump from completely degraded to completely restored, but incrementally can help move that process along?
Well, the thing is, like, we know so little about how to restore these areas that there's not going to be a big step to be taken, even with a lot of money. I think it would take a lot of research to do it. I think I would work on the herbaceous cover first, because if you don't, then you get a lot of invasive species coming in, particularly, I guess, here in Brazil, where I know most of the work. So I would work on trying to cover the ground with some herbaceous cover, and that could also be a way of maintaining low-intensity grazing that would be good for the community. It's been shown in other types of grassland. I don't know if it's been shown for tropical grasslands, but at least where I work in southern France, it's been shown that even with a much less productivity on the native grasslands, the sheep are getting way better food there because of the species diversity. So because it's so diverse, they eat a little bit of everything, and they get more than if they had more biomass of a couple of species. So working on the diversity of the herbaceous layer would be good.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hold on one moment, and I will bring you some tokens of appreciation from the conference committee. We really appreciate your being here with us this morning. So far, we've been on a tour of forest ecosystems and restoration, and now grasslands. And now I have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker, who will be moving us into marine environments, talking about linking science and practice to safeguard coral reefs in the Anthropocene. So I'll invite to the stage Dr. Terry Hughes. He has broad research interests in ecology, marine biology, and also socio-ecological dynamics of coral reefs. Terry received his PhD in the United States from Johns Hopkins University. He also was an NSF postdoctoral fellow at the University of California in Santa Barbara before moving to Australia in 1990, where he took a position with James Cook University. A recurrent theme in Terry's work is the application of new scientific knowledge towards improving management, specifically of marine environments. His recent work has focused on management and transformative governance of the sea in multiple countries: Australia, Chile, China, Galapagos Islands, Gulf of Maine, and the Coral Triangle. Importantly, Terry was elected a fellow of the Australian Academy of Science in 2001 in recognition of a career which has significantly advanced the world's store of scientific knowledge. I looked on Google Scholar, and his career citations exceed 40,000. The excellence of Terry's work has been recognized, however, beyond these scientific citations. In 2008, he received the prestigious Darwin Medal of the International Society for Reef Studies. In 2014, he was awarded an Einstein Professorship by the Chinese Academy of Sciences. And last year, he was recognized by Nature magazine as one of the 10 people who mattered last year for his work on climate change and coral bleaching. We're so pleased to have you for your presentation this morning. Would you prefer the microphone? Or this or this?
No, I'd use this.
Okay.
Good morning, everyone. Sorry for that minor delay. I'm just getting my stopwatch going so I don't go over time. I'm very conscious that I'm the final impediment between you and your second cup of coffee for the day. So I, too, would like to express my sincere gratitude to the organizing committee for inviting me here today. I haven't been at a meeting like this probably since I was a first-year graduate student, where I knew absolutely nobody. So it's been a delight to meet you all, a very different community of researchers and practitioners than I usually rub shoulders with. So thanks for your hospitality, and thanks for thinking outside the square and inviting a perfect stranger to talk to you. So I'll get going and hopefully let you have your coffee soon. So here's my map of the world showing in red where coral reefs are located throughout the tropics and the subtropics. Coral reefs in the Western world, like Australia, where I come from, are known for their biodiversity, and we value their aesthetics, their incredible beauty. In Australia, the Great Barrier Reef alone supports a $6 billion tourism industry, and it employs 65,000 people. But in the rest of the world, where 90% of the world's coral reefs occur, more typically coral reefs are valued for the livelihoods they provide to about 400 million people, and also the food security and nutritional security that reef fisheries provide, mainly to relatively poor people in relatively small, rapidly developing countries. So my talk today has three parts. I'll start out by giving you a very quick overview of the three major threats to coral reefs. Then I'll talk about the history and current practices in coral reef restoration. And finally, I'll look to the future and look to securing a future for coral reefs in the context of restoration, preservation, and conservation broadly defined. So the three big impacts on reefs worldwide, which vary in strength depending on location, are number one, overfishing. So that's a picture of a very large grouper. There aren't too many fish that are large enough to have two small children for breakfast in the oceans anymore, and that's just a short list of many of the species that in Australia have been severely depleted, typically by about 90%. Runoff from land, the delivery of sediment and pollutants from agricultural land and from urban areas into the sea is another big issue. This is the coast of Queensland on the left, and on the right, the blue bit is the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, which is a World Heritage Area. So a big problem for the Great Barrier Reef is runoff of sediment, particularly during flooding events. And the new and third major threat to reefs around the world, regardless of how many people are present locally, is global warming. So that graph shows you temperature anomalies through time over the last century or so. So the blue bars represent years where the temperature was below the long-term running average for this period, and the red ones show positive anomalies, global warming. And you can see that 2015 on that graph is the tallest bar. 2016 was taller again, and 2017 is shaping up to be similar to 2015. So the major consequences for coral reefs of global warming is a phenomenon called coral bleaching, and coral bleaching can lead to very high levels of mortality in corals. And that's a picture of a diver with a heavily bleached reef taken last year on the Great Barrier Reef during a global marine heat wave, which has had terrible consequences to the world's coral reefs. So I'm going to show you now 2 short movie clips. They're really horror movies. They should be rated R for their content. The first one is underwater, to show you what bleaching looks like to a diver, and I'll follow that with an aerial movie clip that I took from a helicopter during the bleaching event of 2016. So this is a shallow reef on the Great Barrier Reef. This reef shows about 70% bleaching. Bleaching is very selective. It predominantly affects branching corals and table-shaped corals, about the size of a coffee table. Other species in this movie are less bleached or unbleached. They're more thermally tolerant. The temperature at this period is about 2 degrees centigrade above the normal summer maximum, which has caused thermal stress. And this is what bleaching looks like from the air. I took this footage from a helicopter in the northern part of the Great Barrier Reef. I spent 30 hours in the helicopter and another 4 days in a fixed-wing airplane, mapping out the extent of the coral bleaching. So it's not rocket science. You simply record on a scale from 0 to 4 the extent of the bleaching. So these reefs are all 4, meaning more than 60% of the corals are bleached. When bleaching is this severe, we typically get mortality rates of corals of 50% or higher. So in March, April 2016, and tragically again this year in March, I undertook an aerial survey of the Great Barrier Reef. Now I have to remind you of the scale of the Barrier Reef. It's 2,300 kilometers long, and it's up to 250 kilometers wide. Its area is 344,000 square kilometers, which is about the same size as Italy, Germany, or Japan. So it's pretty vast. It takes 7 or 8 days of flying to crisscross the reef. Those red squiggles are the flight paths that we took. It looks like the pilot had had several gin and tonics too many, but of course the objective here is to intersect with as many reefs as we can and to score them in terms of their bleaching. The objective is very simply to map out the extent of the bleaching, where is it happening, where is it the most extreme, and to try and explain the geography of the bleaching in terms of where the hot water was, which we get from satellite data. A couple of weeks after I did the 2016 flight, I put out this tweet. You probably think I'm too old to tweet, but I do. This tweet has actually been viewed by 600,000 people. So this was our preliminary result showing very severe bleaching in the northern third of the Great Barrier Reef, affecting 81% of reefs severely. More moderate bleaching in the middle part of the Great Barrier Reef in yellow, and no bleaching in the southern part. The reason the southern part of the Barrier Reef escaped is because a very well-timed cyclone came from Fiji and settled on the southeast corner of Queensland and brought the temperature of the southern Great Barrier Reef down by about 2 degrees centigrade from its summer maximum and saved it from bleaching. This is the more formal analysis of our 2016 aerial scores, which we published in the March 16th issue of Nature this year. We also have older maps from 2 previous bleaching events in 2002 and 1998, which have a different geographic footprint, and in each of the 3 cases, where the bleaching occurred can be explained very precisely by where the hot water was in each of those 3 events. At the same time that I was flying around in a helicopter and 12-seater fixed-wing airplane, We had about 100 divers underwater for a month on 150 reefs stretching along the length of the Great Barrier Reef, measuring the extent of bleaching underwater and also the baseline abundance of corals and the species composition. And then 8 months later, we went back to see what was left. And this is a picture from one of the more severely bleached reefs in the northern part of the Great Barrier Reef. So almost all of the corals in that picture are dead in the aftermath of the bleaching event. We now have a simplified map for public release, which we have done, of the pattern of mortality. So the red swath of reefs, which is 700 kilometers long, lost a median of 67% of their corals. So the pattern of mortality north-south mirrors the pattern of bleaching 8 months later. We haven't yet published that. The formal version of that map is currently in review. And then tragically, the bleaching occurred for the first time back-to-back in 2 consecutive years. So 2017 was the 4th bleaching on the Great Barrier Reef since 1998. The pattern this year was different. So in 2016, the north suffered the most bleaching and the most mortality. The overall loss of corals for the whole Great Barrier Reef, including the green bit in the south in 2016, was 30%. 1 in 3 corals on the world's largest coral reef system. And in 2017, our estimate is 19% additional mortality. So roughly 49%, half of the corals of the Great Barrier Reef have died in the last 18 months. It's completely unprecedented and a terrible tragedy. So to summarize that, the the footprint is nearly 2,000 kilometers. Half the corals have died. The recovery time, the interval between pairs of recurrent bleaching events, is getting shorter and shorter. We've now seen for the first time a return time of 0, 1 year really. So now we can be quite sure that the northern and central barrier reefs has changed forever, because the recovery that will be possible between now and the next bleaching event will necessarily be incomplete. It takes about 10 to 15 years for the fastest growing, weediest corals to fully recover. And if you lose a 50 or 100 or a 200-year-old coral, it takes at least that length of time for them to be replaced, and that's simply no longer possible. So the context for this symposium is there's now an upsurge in interest in Australia and throughout the tropics in possibly using restoration in the sense of replanting reefs to try and help them to recover. So I want to move on now to the second part of my talk, and I'll talk about the history of restoration and how people are going about doing this, and I'll also talk about whether or not it's cost effective. So coral restoration is not new, although many people now are calling for a big effort in this arena. And there are many lessons we can take from what we know about past attempts at restoration. So these stars show the location of existing or historical restoration projects on coral reefs around the world. There's a hotspot in the Caribbean, and that's because the Caribbean coral reefs have been degraded for longer than elsewhere, and another hotspot in the Coral Triangle region, so-called, in Southeast Asia, and again for the same reason. Those reefs have been degraded by overfishing and runoff long before they were further degraded by recent bouts of bleaching. One of the impetuses in the Caribbean for the resurgence of restoration projects was the decision by the US government to put 2 species of corals, the elkhorn coral and the staghorn coral, on the US endangered species list. And because of that status, there's a legal requirement for a recovery plan for these two species. So the United States agencies responsible for this have put out a recovery plan with a costing. I should say that this recovery plan is only for US territories in the Caribbean. So it doesn't include the three largest islands, Cuba, Hispaniola, and Jamaica. The cost to recover these two species in the US territories in the Caribbean is estimated at least $255 million. And the timeline for that recovery, wait for it, is 400 years. According to this recovery plan. So historically, people concerned about degradation of coral reefs have looked at the possibility of using various artificial structures or artificial reefs. This is a very popular example. These are concrete balls, and they are supposed to provide a substrate for juvenile corals to settle on, and the holes are designed to provide some three-dimensional habitat structure that is potentially attractive to fish. The issue, though, for coral reefs is not the lack of hard substrate. Dead corals provide an entirely suitable substrate for new corals to settle on. So I think by and large, this approach has not been very successful. These things cost a fortune. You can buy them off the internet. And for a further expenditure, you can arrange to have the ashes of your pet or your mother-in-law or possibly yourself mixed in with the concrete. So Eternal Reefs mix cremated remains into eco-friendly concrete. And you can decide for yourself whether that really does resemble a recovered coral reef or not. There's also the rubber solution. This is off Florida. This was a disaster because no self-respecting coral will settle on an old rubber tire. And the tires were actually recovered and taken back on land. Another approach is artificial corals. These are ceramic corals. So I mentioned one spurt of restoration was triggered by the Endangered Species Act in the Caribbean. Another spurt was the Asian tsunami in December 2004, which of course tragically killed many, many people and also smashed up lots of coral reefs in the Southeast Asia region. This is not a good idea. The next time a cyclone occurs, after these ceramic corals are deployed, they'll simply turn into rubble. And rubble, whether it's artificial or coral rubble, is a detriment to settlement of juvenile corals because it's too mobile. It moves around, and corals like to be stuck to the bottom. Another approach is to electrify a dome-shaped grid. So you connect it to the mains, being careful not to electrocute anyone with the cables that cross the beach. These have been used around the world, and that's what they look like underwater. And the idea is that the electric current somehow favors growth rates of the corals by changing the chemistry. There's no scientific evidence that I'm aware of that actually supports that contention. So there's lots of attempts as people try and find a technique that actually works and that is potentially scalable. But these attempts have brought with them some words of caution from various bodies. So an international body called ICRI put out a resolution in 2005, so about a year after the Asian tsunami, when a lot of these activities were being promoted, that said the use of artificial electric or concrete reefs is really not a good idea. I'll talk more about coral transplantation in a moment. And they concluded that newly transplanted corals will probably die if the reason for degradation of the reef is not actually dealt with in the first place. And that's a principle I'm sure that everyone in this room is familiar with in the terrestrial context, but the message hasn't always got through in the coral reef context. So those are some of the restoration failures. I want to talk now about some of the more successful approaches. So moving corals, collecting corals, growing them up in some sort of a nursery, and then outplanting them on a degraded site is the current favored method of coral restoration. But I want to make one point with this photograph, and I'll just put my pointer down. You can carry one coral in this hand. You can carry coral number 2 in that hand. So it takes 6 people to carry 12 corals. So restoration underwater is inherently difficult, and the major cost is the cost of labor, manpower, womanpower, in moving these corals around. And the distances are obviously determined by how long you can hold your breath for or how long you can swim for. So there are inherent limitations in our ability to scale up corals. These are 3 examples of different techniques for coral nurseries. One's from the Caribbean, one's from the Indian Ocean, and one is from the Pacific. So the technique is basically the same. You collect corals that are alive from a donor location, if you like. You can then propagate them asexually, which is a fancy way of you can break them up into smaller bits, and then you can encourage the growth of those small branches or nubbins by putting them in a protected place so that they're on an elevated platform or suspended from ropes. There is a fair amount of maintenance associated with these nurseries. You have to scrub the substrate to stop seaweed from growing and overgrowing the corals. But by having them elevated above the sediment and away from a reef, you do have good survivorship because there's less predation and less mortality from sediment. Typically, these are grown in a nursery for a year or 2, and then they are attached with some sort of glue or epoxy onto a recipient reef. The big challenge, though, is scaling this up. So that rack on the left probably has enough corals to recolonize 3 square meters with a density of 5 to 10 corals. So the scale of these restorations is quite small, and I'll show you some data on that in a moment. The other approach is to raise larvae, and I'll talk about that in a moment. I found this website where you can adopt a coral, and I'm not being critical of the crowdsourcing for this funding. I want to make 2 points. First of all, they want people to donate $50 per fragment, which is collected from a reef and grown up in a nursery. And for your $50, you'll get a digital photograph of your fragment after it's collected, and then you'll get an image once it's outplanted. What's conspicuously missing from these promises is a photograph of the coral in 2 years or 5 years or 10 years. So many of these nursery projects seem to consider the completion of the project as the time when the outplanting is done. Restoration complete, let's go home. I haven't found in the literature, including the grey literature, a single coral reef restoration project that had a control. And the monitoring post-deployment after the nursery phase is often absent or very short. The other point I want to make here is about the costing. So if you think of $50 per fragment times 10 fragments per square meter times 10,000 square meters in a hectare, the cost of this enterprise is roughly $5 million per hectare. We've lost 20,000 square kilometers of coral on the Great Barrier Reef in the last 18 months. So to use this technique to restore that area of coral will cost $4 trillion. That's 12 zeros. So there's a real challenge here to scale up. The other approach is to collect the eggs and sperm of corals when they spawn during a single week once per year. The larvae that are fertilized within a few minutes of the spawning settle typically 5 to 10 days afterwards. You can settle them out in the lab onto substrates, and then you can glue the substrate onto the reef. This is still very experimental at this stage. The challenge for this approach is that corals have a type 3 survivorship curve. So very heavy losses. So literally millions of larvae translate 10 years later into a single adult coral. So the challenge is to somehow bypass the tyranny of a type 3 survivorship curve in order to make this approach more successful. And I suspect there are more prospects for success using this approach than using the fragment approach. Last year there was a very useful review published in the journal Ecological Applications on the cost and feasibility of marine coastal restoration. So these authors looked at the area that has been restored and the cost of those restorations for a variety of marine habitats. They found, not surprisingly, given the complexity of coral reefs, that reefs are the most expensive, and mangroves, which are by far the most accessible, you can walk around in a mangrove at low tide, the cost there is much less. The average mean cost was, however, 1.6 million per hectare, so incredibly expensive. And as I said, coral reefs are at the upper end of that estimate. And they looked at whether the cost per hectare for coral reefs decreased with the size of the restoration, and they found that it did not. And finally, they made the observation that many of the studies they were reviewing are still small in scale and experimental. So this is a useful study, but it had one flaw, and that is how they found these studies of restoration. They used the scientific literature. They used Web of Science and Scopus. And most of the accounts of restoration are in the grey literature, and many of them are published in languages other than English. So in preparation for this talk, I had another look at the literature more broadly, and I found a lot more studies of coral restoration than are described in this paper. So this is the area of existing coral reef restorations going back to about 1980. So the y-axis is the number of studies, and the x-axis is the restoration area in square meters. So the tallest bar there is typically restoration projects that are a few tens of square meters in extent. The median area is 178 square meters, which is probably smaller than the area of this podium. So it's a real challenge to scale up from that to something like the catastrophic loss of corals we've seen during the global bleaching event in 2016. And this is the frequency distribution for a subset of those 76 studies that gave a costing. The median cost is around $1 million. So the total area of all the restoration projects I could find, 76 of them, is 14 hectares. And the total cost of 43 of them was $24 million. So a huge amount of money for a very small area of restoration. So I want to finish up now to talk about the future of coral reefs. And I want to talk about this paper. It's a review article that I published this year that I've been thinking about for probably 10 or more years. I'm often asked as a coral reef scientist by the general public, by the media, by politicians, what's the prospect for the Great Barrier Reef and for coral reefs in general? Will we have a Great Barrier Reef in 50 years or 100 years? And there's no shortage of gloom and doom and no shortage of people with the opinion that no, we won't. My take on this is somewhat more optimistic. And I wrote down some of my thoughts in this review paper. The co-authors on this paper are an interesting mix of people. Quite a few of them are social scientists. So as a card-carrying biologist, I've come to realize during my career that knowing everything there is to know about the biology of coral reefs is not going to save them, because the coral reef crisis is a crisis of governance. It's about governance of climate change, governance of fisheries, governance of land use, and runoff of pollutants into the ocean. So really what we need to think more about, other than the biology, is the human dimensions of coral reefs. We need to think about policies, about legal frameworks, about institutions, about norms of behavior, and about how different social actors or stakeholders share power and make decisions. So a large part of this paper is actually about social science. Some of the other authors on this paper are modelers. So one of the issues we address is the causes of coral reef degradation. So coral reef monitoring is a global business. Hundreds of millions of dollars are spent counting fish and counting corals every year. What we tend not to measure is the pressures on reef. And I've mentioned that there are 3 major pressures. So part of this paper is to look at the cumulative impacts of multiple pressures and how feedbacks in those pressures cause non-linear or threshold responses that tip coral reefs from a healthy condition in red, where the pressures from fishing, climate, and nutrients are relatively low, into a degraded condition in green. And over the last years and decades, we've seen more and more coral reefs tip out of the red zone into the unstable purple zone, where both healthy and degraded reefs can coexist, and finally into the degraded condition. So the challenge for restoration is actually, in a broader sense, to reduce these 3 pressures through better governance. So our first conclusion is that maintaining functional reefs will require better management and governance to all of those pressures. Typically, we manage 1 or 2 of them, but rarely do we manage all 3. And now, through the COP21 mechanism, we finally have a roadmap for dealing with climate change. So in the context of climate change, if the COP21 targets of 1.5 to 2 degrees global average warming are achieved, what will that mean for tropical oceans? So one of the authors on this paper, 2, were physical oceanographers, and they helped us produce this graph. This is a graph of predicted tropical ocean temperatures at the end of the century under a COP21 emissions reduction trajectory. And it's not too bad. So the ocean is warming less than the land, and the tropical ocean is warming less than the subtropical and temperate ocean. So the 2-degree target, which is for the whole planet, actually translates for most coral reefs, for about 70% of coral reefs around the world, to about 0.5 degree centigrade of further warming if COP21 is successful. That's approximately the same level of global warming that tropical oceans have already experienced in the last 50 years or so. So it won't be a comfortable place for coral reefs, given the amount of bleaching we've already seen with 1 degree of global average warming. But I think it's doable because bleaching is actually incredibly selective. And I'll come back to that point in just a moment. Here it is. When bleaching occurs, coral reef scientists refer to species that are so-called winners versus losers. So the winner is on the right. That's a very old, slow-growing coral. It grows at about 1 centimeter in diameter per annum. So that coral with the diver is probably close to 200 years. They are tough. They rarely bleach. This one is mildly bleached because the temperature extreme last year was so high, but it survived. They're going to be with us through global warming into the future, provided we can reach the COP21 target. The losers are exemplified on the left. They tend to be branching corals that are thermally intolerant. And so globally, for the last 20 years or more, we've seen a gradual shift in the mix of species. The composition of reefs is changing quite dramatically in terms of an increase in the relative abundance of winners and a corresponding decline in the abundance of losers. That's basically a source of resilience. Another source of resilience is the incredible reproductive capacity of coral reefs. So 50% of the corals on the Barrier Reef died last year, 50% survived. That 50% will produce billions and billions of larvae each year into the future. So we have just witnessed a huge natural selection event that is changing the composition of corals. It's not wiping them out entirely, it's changing them. So our second point is that reefs will face a climate gauntlet. They'll transform, but they're not hopefully going to disappear. And this is my final slide, which is a little bit complicated, so it'll take me a minute to explain it. I've just got a signal to finish up. So the S-shaped squiggle in these three graphs indicate the response curve of a coral reef to a driver as it strengthens on the x-axis from weak levels of overfishing, pollution, and global warming to stronger levels. It's S-shaped because typically these systems show a nonlinear response or a threshold response. So the first response to conserving or restoring the former glory of coral reefs is to reduce the drivers. And that will push the condition of the reefs, the black ball, back away from the threshold. That's basically the argument of the planetary boundary concept that I'm sure many of you have heard about. The second option is to change the composition of the corals so that they become less sensitive to a given level of driver. In other words, the threshold is pushed out to the right. And that's already happening in nature through the selective mortality of winners versus losers. That's also an option for intervention in terms of restoration and rebuilding the resilience of coral reefs. And the third approach is to change the shape of the response curve by manipulating the feedbacks that cause the threshold in the first instance. And probably the best example of that is actually in the social realm, where people can be incentivized or taxed to change their behavior so that there's less levels of global emissions of greenhouse gases. So our final point is that reefs do have a future, but it's a very different future. Thank you very much.
Terry, thank you so much for that illuminating talk on the status of coral reefs and options for restoration. It was a bit sobering, but we appreciate the focus on potential management directions. So we, I think, can take one quick question, and we have so many.
I am the first because I got the microphone. Professor Terry, thank you for your great talk. And I'm almost desperate because we have so many problems, and in Brazil we have a single project about coral reefs. And we have many students here. And I would ask you a recommendation and advice. If our students want to start studying coral reefs restoration, from where to start?
Yeah, that's a very good question. The center that I direct actually has 208 PhD students, and they come from 45 countries. So one option, I guess, is to enroll in a master's or a PhD program. Certainly, there's a huge amount of research that still needs to be done on coral reef restoration. It's a nut that I think has not yet been cracked in terms of being cost-effective above a scale of about a hectare.
Great, thank you. I have a token of appreciation for you, and see, we want a photograph? Yeah? And a few gifts as well. Thank you. So just very quickly before everyone disperses, we're excited to welcome you back to the plenary room for the closing ceremony at 4 o'clock, and then to continue the festivities with samba and capoeira at 5:30, which will be outside at the pool. So thanks to all of our speakers and all of you for attending.